Yahweh's covenant with Israel at Mount Sinai. Exodus. So, God's covenant with Israel at Mount Sinai. So let's pick up our storyline just so we're all on the same page. God brings Israel out of Egypt. We call that the Exodus. But once they leave Egypt, remember we looked at the verse where it says they plundered the Egyptians. Keep in mind at this point, they are not yet clear. They still have one major obstacle, and what was that? The Red Sea. So the Red Sea actually marks kind of the completion of God's judgment of Pharaoh, because it's in the Red Sea where he buried Pharaoh and his army, okay? But then after they leave the Red Sea, they go and they journey what region? I'm not looking for a proper name. I'm looking for an area. The wilderness. They're in the wilderness. And what is Israel's time in the wilderness always marked by? Anybody know? Something that we oftentimes, even though we live in prosperity, are oftentimes, complaining and grumbling. Yeah, Israel in the wilderness is constantly complaining and grumbling. And in particular in this section where they're going from Egypt to Sinai, they complain and they grumble about what? Yeah, the necessities of life, food and water. Okay? So that brings us, they journey through the wilderness and then they come to Mount Sinai and they camp at the base of Mount Sinai. Now, Mount Sinai, when they get there, is God's presence shows up in a miraculous way. It's described as having thunder and lightning, clouds on top of the mountain. So just imagine standing at the base of the mountain and seeing a monster thunderstorm on top, but it was more than just a thunderstorm. In Exodus 24, Moses says that God's appearance on the top of the mountain was like a consuming fire. So it's this awe-inspiring appearance of God on top of the mountain to enter into a covenant with Israel. Now, where have we seen Mount Sinai before? Last class period, talk to me. The burning bush. But remember in Exodus 3, this mountain was called an H word, Horeb, Mount Horeb, okay? So same mountain. And by the way, in both places, God appears as fire. One, the burning bush is not consumed. The other, it looks like the mountain is being consumed. So there's a contrast and a similarity there. So let's jump in and think about these that God's covenant with Israel. So let me ask you a question. If you're watching a YouTube video and it all of a sudden hits slow-mo in the video, what is that signaling to you? Okay, yeah, so it's an important part, and usually, like, especially if it's like a blooper video, something bad's about to happen or something funny, right, depending on your perspective. So it's like just at the moment when the skateboarder, his face is about to hit the asphalt and slide, that's the slow-mo. That's again, for him it's not funny, but for everyone else it is. All right, so you understand, typically when we're watching something and it slows down, it wants us to reflect on the importance or the gravity of the moment. So check this out. We've been reading the biblical story from Genesis 1 to Exodus 19. And we talked about this last class period. For instance, Moses, he's born, and the next half chapter, he's 40. It's like, shoom, this biblical story has been smoking. But we get to Mount Sinai in Exodus 20, and Israel is camped at Mount Sinai from Exodus 20 all the way to Numbers 10. And you know how much time passes in that long period of stretch of biblical text? 11 months. So the camera has gone slow-mo on us. And as the camera goes slow-mo in the biblical story, guess what we see a lot of, or read a lot of? What's the covenant? It's a bunch of what? Laws. We get law code. Law code. So here's what I want you guys to do. It's Friday. We need to wake up. I want you guys just to pair up, real quick, for 2 minutes. Just discuss with your neighbor or a group, whoever, how you want to do it. Let's just be honest. When we get to Exodus 20 and on through Leviticus and even Numbers, it's pretty hard reading. Would you guys not agree? Leviticus derails many Christians, I'm going to read the Bible this year plan. Okay? So let's be honest. Why is it difficult to read through all these laws? That's what I want you guys to discuss. All right, let's talk about it. Somebody give me some reasons why they're so difficult. So one sense, there's different views between Christians and how we are to either not live under these or live under these, and we'll talk about some of that on Monday, actually. But all Christians would say that there are many, many, many of these laws that do not apply to us at all, right? In fact, there are many, many of them that you can't even obey because, let's just be honest, we're not camping in the wilderness with a tabernacle, okay? It's boring. Okay, so one is they don't apply to us. The other is I mean, if we're honest, it's kind of boring. And let's just not, it's just nothing against the Bible. It's just boring to read law code, period, right? I mean, how many of you in your spare time Google Branson City ordinances and just meditate? Not very riveting, okay, right? Even if you took the laws and put them in some creative YouTube video, they still wouldn't be that riveting, right? It reminds me of the Arab lines. Have any of you flown lately? Okay, some of you have. If you've flown lately, so whenever you fly, you know they have all the rules like buckle your seatbelt, the oxygen mask comes down, you know, all that stuff. Well, they realize that people just didn't pay attention because they're boring. And so what they started doing now is creating these creative videos that they play, especially like Southwest Airlines. And the videos they're just corny. They're just awful. So you don't pay attention anyway. But the point is even if you take rules and you stick them in a creative video, they're still what? Boring. They're still rules. They're still boring, yes. So good. Was another one. So one is the cultural barrier and the understanding of them. So let me give you another example. There's one that says, I got you, JC. There's one that says, you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. Let me clarify. It's talking about a kid goat. Sorry, but it's talking about a kid goat, okay? So again, I mean, I get what that is. Like you kill the kid, you butcher it, and then you but anyway, the point is I'm not tempted to do that. So like that's the cultural distance. So one point is we just are opposed to rules and laws, period. So we just would rather move on. That's good. Thank you all. That's great. So I think those are all valid reasons. And so because you've given me such good valid reasons, you've convinced me not to go verse by verse through the laws. Okay? In all seriousness, I'm just going to hit some big things you need to know. But before we get to the big things you need to know, let's talk about the nature of this covenant. So big picture real quick. So the covenant at Sinai is what we're going to talk about. I don't have this on the slide, but I just want you to be aware there are several titles for this covenant. Does anybody know the major, most prominent title of this covenant? Actually, probably two, but what's the name for this covenant? Anybody? So, what's that? Somebody said it. Mosaic covenant or the Old Covenant. The Old Covenant's a very common name for it. It also can be called the Sinai covenant. Obviously there, right? So this is the covenant God made with Israel at Mount Sinai. And the first thing that we need to know is that this would be definitely what we might call a conditional covenant. And by that, I mean this is a covenant God entered into with Israel, but the fulfillment and we might say the longevity of this covenant depended on Israel. They had to keep up their end of the deal. So here's the deal. In Exodus 19, Moses goes up to the top of the mountain, and God gives him some words to take back down to the Israelites. And these are them. After reminding them of what he did for them in Egypt, he then says, now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So, really easy. What is Israel's end of the deal? Keep the covenant. Obey my voice, right? So if Israel would obey the covenant, and by obey the covenant or keep my covenant, that means obey the laws in the covenant, then God says, then he will do some things for them. I want to skip the part where it says the treasure possession, not because it's not important, but simply for time, and go to the last line. It says, so then you will be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So let's start with the last one, a holy nation. What does the word holy mean? Set apart. Good. Now, we think oftentimes of set apart from. That is true, by the way. So what this means is that Israel's a holy nation. They are set apart from whom? The other nations. Okay? So the holiness, that's what all these laws are for, by the way. This is why the laws make a lot of sense in an ancient Near Eastern agrarian context, because it was God's way of setting Israel apart for obedience. Everybody got that part? Okay, so he would set them apart, but here's the deal. We also, I'll come back to this, want to think about being set apart is not set apart from, but set apart to. In other words, we think of holiness, especially like as Christians in our culture, as just saying no to culture. And that is true. But what drives the no is the fact that we are holy, we're supposed to be holy to God. We're set apart for him in his service, if that makes sense. So Israel is set apart, and then it says they were going to be a kingdom of priests. What do priests do? Anybody? They were the priests were the mediators between Israel and God in the matters around the tabernacle and the temple. So they sacrificed, they pronounced cleanliness. So here's my question. If Israel as a whole is supposed to be a kingdom of priests, who are they mediating between? God and? Somebody said it. The nations. The reason I want to point this out is to show you how this is consistent with what we talked about with the Abrahamic covenant. You remember the Abrahamic covenant says, in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. You remember the illustration I used of the blessings as a pipeline, Abraham as a pipeline? Well, you can see this even with Israel. God was setting them apart as a holy nation, not so they could hoard the blessings God would give them, but that so they could be a kingdom of priests and mediate the blessing to the nations. Okay? So in other words, on the prophets, the phrase is they were to be a light to the nations. Now, we'll talk about whether they kept up their end of the deal or not on Monday, but for today, we'll just leave it at that. Does that make sense? There's the condition. Okay, I want to show you a big picture real quick and talk about the covenant in context. So you see down here at the bottom of the screen, I have Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Those are the first 5 books of the Bible, and typically most Christians read those books as standalone books, right? We think of Leviticus as a book by itself. But please keep in mind that has never been the case biblically. These 5 books are actually one book in the Bible. The Jews refer to this book as the what? As the Torah. Have y'all heard that before? The Torah? That's what they refer to as the Torah, those 5 books together. In academic discussions, they're oftentimes called the Pentateuch, which is a Greek word that means like 5-part book. And then I'm going to use a title that Jesus used. Jesus did use Torah, by the way. I'm going to use the title Jesus used, and he called it the Book of Moses. So because Moses was the author, so the Book of Moses is the 5-fold book here, okay? Now, it's kind of like, think with me of Lord of the Rings. How many books is Lord of the Rings? I heard 6, I heard 3. Okay, how many, in Tolkien's preface though, he said he intended the work to be read as what? One book. So think of those books, so the lowercase b, and then the Lord of the Rings as a b. In other words, he intended them to be read as a unified story. Does that make sense? And that's the same way here. These books are one book that's a unified story that was crafted as one literary unit. Does that help make sense? So here's the reason this is important. On Monday, we're going to highlight how all the white on this screen helps us understand all the yellow. Because the yellow is the laws, and the white are the stories around the laws. Does that make sense? So that's why context is going to be so important. Any questions on that? Okay, so it's Friday. You guys are exhausted. And instead of me lecturing you on the laws, I figured I would let the Bible Project lecture you on the laws. So I'm going to show you their video on Leviticus. And some of you might be like, oh, no, not on the Bible Project. And then some of you are pumped, and I appreciate that. Okay, so let's watch their video on Leviticus. 10 minutes of class. Again, great video, right? A lot of goats getting chopped. But let's talk about 3 key items that I want you to know from these laws. So we're just basically summarizing like all the laws. I'm going to give you a big picture with 3 key items. First, let's talk about the tabernacle. Tabernacle. So here is a diagram of the tabernacle from the ESV Study Bible. Again, all the maps and diagrams I use are from ESC Study Bible. But what is the most important component of the tabernacle is what? Is God's dwelling place among his people. Okay, so it was, you can see it's a portable tent that they would carry through the wilderness, the desert, right? And then they would set up camp around this tabernacle. So right here, this is the actual tent. In this picture, it's a cutaway, so it wouldn't have looked this way. Here's the actual tent where God, the priest served. That's the tabernacle, and this is called the courtyard. It's like a giant privacy fence that they built around there. Okay, a few things about the tabernacle. I've already hinted at this when we talked about the Garden of Eden. But you remember there's parallels between the Garden of Eden and the tabernacle. There's numerous parallels. The most important is God's presence on earth. Secondly, here's a big picture one is, guess which direction the tabernacle faced? East. Why is that important? We know the garden faced east because when God kicked Adam and Eve out, he put a cherubim in front of the entrance so that they couldn't get back in. So that's why all biblical sanctuaries point to the east. They're patterned after the Garden of Eden. There's numerous other parallels, like the color of gold in there, the cherubim on the curtain, so forth and so on. But there is one major reminder or difference between the tabernacle and the garden. And what is that? The limited access to God's presence. If the garden, if man had not rebelled and stayed, if Adam and Eve had not rebelled, every human would have access to God's presence in the garden. But what we see here is that the closer you get to God's presence, the less people can come, right? So, for instance, you can see this is the courtyard area. This is the altar of burnt offering where they offered their kind of daily sacrifices morning and evening and other burnt offerings. Here's priests standing by a basin of water, which they would do ritual cleansing before they served. And then we get the tabernacle with two rooms. The holy place, which the priest could enter daily. And then you get the Holy of Holies, which is where the Ark of the Covenant was, which symbolized God's presence. And only one person, the high priest, could enter once a year. So you see, the closer you get to God's presence, the more limited access is. And that contrasts with the garden. Okay? So, what does this show us? Backwards looking, it reinforces what we said about the garden, that it was God's original sanctuary. But moving the other way in the story, what this shows us is that God is seeking to restore creation, right? So think about it this way. He's putting the tabernacle as kind of a recreation of Eden in the middle of the wilderness. So God's trying to restore his creation. Does that help? Second thing, real quick, is the priesthood. So the priests were part of the tribe of Levi, but the priests were from whose family? Who was the first high priest? Aaron. So there were Aaron and his son served as the priests, okay? Now the Levites worked around the tabernacle, but the priests were Aaron and his sons. We've already said priests did what? Their primary function? To mediate blessing. So that's where we get that. And to show you how they mediated, if you look at the priestly garments over here, do you see the breastplate with the 12 stones on it? Take a wild guess at what the 12 stones represent. The 12 tribes of Israel. So you can see as the priest walks into the tabernacle to do his service, he's symbolically walking in bearing the 12 tribes of Israel as their representative. Okay? Now, if you look at the turban, the hat that they wear, there's a gold ring, gold plate at the bottom, and it says Kadesh La Yahweh, which means holiness to Yahweh. So that emphasizes the point I made earlier, that holiness is not just set apart from, it's set apart to. So because the priests were specially working at the tabernacle, they were set apart for that service to Yahweh. That served as the reason why they had higher standards than the other people. So they were more holier, so to speak, or supposed to be more holy than the normal people because they served in the tabernacle close to God's presence. Does that make sense on that? So holy to the Lord. So that's the priest, and they served there in the tabernacle. All right, the last thing, and I want you to listen closely. I know you're tired. Listen closely to the point I'm about to make. let's talk about the sacrificial system and something very important about that. So write down sacrificial system, and then here's what I'll say. There is a very, 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 very common misunderstanding among Christians that in the Old Testament, Israelites were quote-unquote saved through the sacrificial system. And by what we mean by saved is like sins eternally forgiven, being in the presence of God, right, when they die. That is not the teaching of the Bible. The book of Hebrews makes that very clear, that the blood of bulls and goats cannot take away sins. So here's how we need to understand the sacrificial system. We understand it in the context of God in the camp. So when Israel sacrificed an individual or Israel, they oftentimes, well, you remember the Bible Project said the sacrifices could say one of two things. What did they say? Thank you or I'm sorry, okay? But when there was a sin offering or a sacrifice related to sin, it atoned for them in the sense it made them richly pure so they could dwell in the camp, so they could be near God's presence. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's why when somebody's unclean, where do they have to go? Outside the camp. So the sacrificial system was serving to maintain ritual purity so that Israel could dwell with their God. That's why it previews Christ's death, because those sacrifices were insufficient. Christ's death is sufficient to take away all our sins. That's the point of the book of Hebrews in the New Testament. So just keep that in mind, okay? All right. The last thing, I don't have it up here, is there's hundreds and hundreds of other laws, and you just need to know that those hundreds and hundreds of laws were meant to do what for Israel? I said it earlier. Make them a what kind of nation? A holy nation, to set them apart. You guys have a great weekend.